Let's start. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be hosting you for this event on multi-stakeholderism and internet shutdowns. I will be chairing this panel today. My name is Kambor Saimbor. I am head of the Democratic Governance and Media Freedom Department in the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. I will quickly go through and introduce our panel members. I'll say a few words and then hand over to my colleagues to also say a few words. And then we hope that we're going to have a interactive session. And please come forward with some questions. We hope that there will be a good half an hour or so available for everyone to actually come in. So I'll just go and introduce those panel members. I'm pleased to say that we've got Felicia Antonio from Access Now, the Keeping On campaign manager. Felicia, do you want to say hello to everyone?
Hi, everyone.
Brilliant.
Good to join you today.
I'm
Thank
also
you, and back.
great. I'm also pleased that we've got Joss Wright from the Oxford Internet Institute at Oxford University from the UK. Joss, would you like to say hello?
Hello, pleased to be here.
Brilliant. And in the room together, we've got Alexandria Walden from Google. Alex, over to you.
Got it. Okay.
Perfect.
Hi. Thank you for inviting us to be part of the session today. I'm Alex Walden. I lead human rights at Google.
Brilliant. And last but not least, we've got Scott Campbell from UNOHCHR. Scott, over to you.
Hi, Scott Campbell, leading the work on tech and human rights at the UN Human Rights Office based in Geneva.
Brilliant. Well, to start the session off, really, I'll say a few remarks. If there's anything I hope you do take away from our session, there are three main messages from me. One is to emphasize the importance of the multi-stakeholder approach. Second is just to talk about the importance of trying to stop internet shutdowns. And finally, just a word on some of the ways in which we can try and prevent shutdowns and the impact that they may have. Firstly, internet shutdowns. I'm conscious I'm in a room where a lot of you are much more technical than I am. From my perspective and the UK's perspective, we are taking a broad approach to internet shutdowns. What that means, you've got a spectrum of activity from one end, which might be classified as a technical shutdown, whereby you can have no access at all to the internet. But then there are a number of other measures in place as well, where, for example, you can have efforts which are aimed at throttling the internet, whereby you can have almost some sort of access, but for all intents and purposes, that access deprives you of the ability to be online. From our perspective, that type of activity is a significant impediment to a free and open interoperable internet, but also it has a significant real-world impact on the lives of people across the world. All of you can imagine, and I'm sure all of you know, what type of impact this could have. It could affect what you might categorize as farmers in the developing world who require and need access to climate data to ensure that they've got the best information available to maximize the yields that they are trying to extract. It can affect a citizen who wants to partake in the democratic process and is unable to express their views online. It might affect a business who needs the ability to access their financial services online quickly and they can't do that. Or it might affect an individual who needs to charge up their electronic car and they can't do that. So all of those type of impacts can have real world impediment to the ability of people to actually carry out their lives. Unfortunately, internet shutdowns are increasing in their prevalence. We are seeing more and more countries who are resorting to internet shutdowns. Access Now have reported a 41% rise of internet shutdowns from 2022. From the UK's perspective, we have been championing the right for this. We have been championing the policy change whereby states no longer shut the internet down. We are arguing that this has a not only significant impact on democratic context, but also most recently in the situation of Bangladesh, it's been reported that the shutdown there during the summer resulted in almost $300 million loss of GDP. So we have been using our G7 presidency in 2021 to argue that this is an important issue and states should refrain from doing so. We're proud to be chairing the Task Force on Internet Shutdowns from the Freedom Online Coalition, and we've been using that for the last 2 years to come up with a number of measures to highlight the importance of this issue. In particular, we have come up with a statement through the FOC on the importance of keeping the internet on in the context of elections. We also, with UNESCO, on the last year's International Day for Universal Access to Information, we came up with the Oxford Statement, which underlined the importance of digital connectivity to both issues around development, but also democracy. And last but not least, we are using our platform here at the IGF as Task Force Internet Shutdowns to highlight this issue. My final comment on all of this is that clearly this is a significant issue, but most importantly, all the measures I've just described, they couldn't have happened without the multi-stakeholder approach. You know, through the FOC, we're proud that we've got colleagues that are represented from academia, private sector, government, civil society coming together. Through the drafting of the election statement on shutdowns, we brought together the multi-stakeholder community, and I know from first-hand experience that diversity of views made that final product much more effective. And also, when we went about the Oxford Statement, we had representatives from over 60 to 80 different organizations, all part of that multi-stakeholder approach, who were able to highlight the importance of this. So a few framing comments from me, but now let me pass on to our panelists to also express their views on this. So I might just start off with Felicia. Felicia, can you talk a little bit more about the key trends you're seeing in 2024 around shutdowns and some of the challenges you foresee insofar as trying to take a collaborative approach? Over to you, Felicia.
Thank you so much, Kanbar. And yeah, definitely I can speak to what we are seeing. I come bearing not so much of good news. And just before I jump into that, just to mention that for those who are not familiar with the Keep It On campaign and coalition, this is a global coalition that is dedicated to fighting internet shutdowns around the world since 2016. And it's currently has over 330 civil society organizations as members. We track internet shutdowns, we advocate against them, we raise awareness, and we work with diverse stakeholders, including governments, regional and international bodies like the UN, the EU, the African Union, the Freedom Online Coalition, as Kanbai mentioned, industry players, journalists, researchers, among others, to push back against internet shutdowns. So we track shutdowns looking at the triggers, which simply triggers are incidents that are likely to get a government to impose a shutdown. And our focus is on deliberate disruptions to the internet, complete shutdowns, throttling, as well as targeting the social media platforms or digital platforms. And so what we've seen over the years since we started documenting shutdowns is that protests, exams, elections, conflicts, major triggers of internet shutdowns. In 2023, unfortunately, conflicts was the main trigger of shutdowns, where we saw 74 shutdowns recorded in 9 countries in times of conflict. And then protest was the second highest of 63 shutdowns in 15 countries. And then we've also seen governments disrupting internet during school exams. And then elections is also an area where governments are likely to disrupt internet access. So for 2024, we are currently working on our annual database, and we've already seen approximately over 270 shutdowns in 40 plus countries globally. And the countries are likely to be more. And if that is the case, we're going to see the highest number of countries where we've documented shutdowns in a single year. And that is not good news. The number of shutdowns are also likely to be really high. But these figures would be finalized early next year when we release our annual reports. And so this, of course, underscores a worrying trend that shutdowns are spreading, increasingly becoming a go-to tool by both repressive and democratic countries. In 2024, we've also already documented 7 shutdowns in new countries that have never imposed internet shutdowns. In 2024, we've seen countries including Comoros, El Salvador, Guinea-Bissau, France disrupting TikTok in New Caledonia, Malaysia and Mauritius, as well as Thailand disrupting or imposing internet shutdown. And in that case, we've also seen 2 members of the Freedom Online Coalition, that is Kenya and France, resorting to the use of internet disruptions. Another worrying trend we are seeing is the deliberate use of cross-border shutdowns. That is countries imposing shutdowns across borders in around the globe. And this is really, really concerning for us as civil society. And so just looking at these trends have indicated some of the challenges is the fact that we are seeing big democracies also resorting to the use of shutdowns. And so it really makes our advocacy work difficult. And so I think it's important for us to continue to hold each and every government that shuts down the internet to account so that we can push back confidently and effectively against internet shutdowns. We've also seen that conflict-related shutdowns is really becoming a big problem, which means that this has implications on, for instance, delivery of humanitarian aid during conflicts. And we are also looking at what alternative sources of connectivity can be provided during conflict to sustain or to ensure that the internet is still or remains open and secure for people, as well as the humanitarian organizations that are operating on the ground. As Kampa, you mentioned, having the international community support civil society advocacy is really crucial. And so, for instance, the statement that the FOP put out prior to the 2024 elections, which where we've seen that 2024 was declared the year of elections, was really, really important for our work. And we continue to use this in our advocacy and engagement with governments under our Election Watch initiative. In 2024, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights also adopted a resolution which recognizes the importance of internet connectivity to the realization of free, fair, and credible elections. And so this was also really timely for our advocacy against internet shutdown. And then prior to some of these milestones, we've also seen governments such as Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Sierra Leone making commitments to keep the internet on during elections in their respective countries. And beginning of the year, we also saw Bangladesh in January, making similar commitments to keep the internet on. I mentioned Mauritius as one of the new countries that have disrupted internet access. And if you may be aware, in November, the authorities issued an order to shut down social media until after elections. And this was like 10 days or so before elections. And this was really shocking. Mauritius had never disrupted internet access, and we all recognize that it's been rated as a free country. And so seeing a country like that imposing shutdowns and even attempting to have the shutdown in place for over 2 weeks was really concerning. And so following backlash from civil society and also engagement with diverse stakeholders, we got the authorities to reverse the shutdown. So it was lifted after 24 hours, and the people went to the polls on November 10, which opened and access to secure internet throughout the electoral processes. So these are some of the cases or trends we've seen so far in 2024. I will pause here and hopefully we can have time for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicia. Some worrying trends there that you've highlighted, but I'm also conscious you concluded with some positive examples as well, where countries have committed to keep the internet on and where the multi-stakeholder approach has helped in terms of advocacy and accountability. Shall we move on to Joss Wright? Joss, if I can bring you in here, could you talk a little bit more about how a much more data-driven approach to this particular challenge can help us to navigate this challenge and maybe come up with better policy approaches? Joss, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really sort of pleased to follow on from what Felicia's just said. And what I want to do in the spirit of talking about this in a multi-stakeholder sense is in the context of a lot of internet governance, multi-stakeholderism traditionally is more about representing the voices of the different people who are being affected by different sort of effects and policies that are going on. But I think there's an interesting shift in perspective on multi-stakeholderism when we are, as a group, trying to address a problem that is fairly universally recognized as a problem. And I think that what I'd like to represent from the perspective of academia here is a form of multi-stakeholderism that isn't so much about hearing all of our voices, but drawing on the perspectives we have in our solutions and our approaches and our abilities to provide some input to resolving the problem. And I think I'd sort of working in this area as an academic with the limitations of academia. I really see that every group that is working in this area, we've got representation from civil society, we've got academia, we've got business, we've got policymakers. Each one has their particular sort of strengths and their particular abilities to affect change in an interesting way. But each has its sort of flip side, its set of weaknesses. And, I'm not going to go into too much detail on all of them because I'll just end up insulting all the amazing work that people are doing in the room. But there is this element of, civil society has got the positive advantage of being on the ground and very sort of solution focused, working directly to reduce the impacts of things like internet shutdowns. But the flip side of that is a tendency to need sort of results quite quickly, to be very solution focused in itself, and have a restriction in the amount of sort of long-term stepping back that can go on. Business, in contrast, has a lot of power, a lot of voice, a lot of resources, a lot of ability to affect the policies of governments through the interactions at the business level. But they also have to sort of take into account their own market considerations, their own sort of legal constraints in doing things like that. The policy side, the government side, is obviously, the strongest voice in being able to push policies forwards, but necessarily is relatively slow, not quite as reactive as it can be. And then from my perspective as an academic, I see our abilities in this area as being more on the kind of flexible methodological innovation, the ability to bring new approaches and maybe longer term questions and understandings, but we tend to have sort of less voice, less sort of capacity to directly interact with policy, and frankly, as academics, maybe a little bit less urgency in directly achieving the solution to a problem. And we're all focused on publishing academic papers because that's all we care about as academics, ultimately, when we should be actually trying to work effectively to help there. But I think that's why the multi-stakeholderism approach is so important, is because the things that academia can bring to the table, if appropriately sort of incentivized, are to take a different perspective and to bring some of the more sort of cutting edge techniques that wouldn't necessarily be practical or applicable for civil society to do, for government to do, or even for business to do. So to speak sort of directly to the academic side of things and my own particular role in this, I think one of the particular strengths we have is the interdisciplinarity that comes out of modern academia, certainly. And it was mentioned at the beginning that this is a very tech-heavy field. And as somebody who studied as a computer scientist, it was quite a frustration to me to realize several decades into my career that I should have studied law, because that's where I would have had much more effect on helping with stopping things like this. But it's a bit late now, so I'll stick with the computer science. But that's the interaction between what we can bring on the data side, the method side, the data science side is something we can bring to this. And traditionally, the limitation of the academic side of this work is that it has been very technologically focused. There's been a lot of work on measuring the internet, measuring shutdowns, providing data, but then not being so interested in doing something with that data. So, we've built a tool that will measure internet shutdowns in X, Y, and Z. Now it's somebody else's job to go off and do the policy advocacy, the interaction with users. Or on that technical side, we're going to build a circumvention tool, and we're going to sort of show that we can get around the internet shutdown, or we can still access the internet in this particular place in a way that is largely meaningless to 95% of the population who don't have advanced computer science degrees that can use these technologies. And so the reality of this is that while this is a technological substrate, a technological basis for what we're talking about here, it's a socio-technical system. It's an attempt to use an important society-wide technology to have control over an aspect of society. And so the research that I do, that my group does here at the Oxford Internet Institute, is largely focused on trying to bridge that gap between the strong technical measurements and the social and political understanding that drives it. Because we do need to understand the technology. We need to know how it works so that we don't make silly mistakes. But we also need to answer the question, why are internet shutdowns happening? Why do states or authorities implement internet shutdowns? Because if we understand that, we can say, look, this is what you're trying to do, and it's not doing what you think it's doing. It's not achieving the goals you've set out for yourself. And then hopefully that's a route into policy to try and prevent that from happening in the future. Or if we're being honest, we need to say this is having the effect that you think it's having, but there are externalities, there are negative sides that are so significant that it's not worth what you're paying for it. And there are many forms of externality. I think, GDP is widely mentioned. Frankly, I think it's a poor measure of the impact of a shutdown. I'm much more interested in people being unable to communicate with friends, people being unable to coordinate their activities, people being unable to access healthcare information, quality news information, and similar. I realize I've already hit the 5-minute limit that I was given for this talk, so I won't talk too much about the work that we're doing here. But I'd like to say that some of the work we have been doing is about bridging these gaps. I'd particularly like to mention the Open Observatory of Network Interference, the UNI project, who have been working strongly with us to provide data, and we reciprocate by giving them the analytical tools the sort of statistical data science, machine learning tools that we can work with here to try and understand how the data around shutdowns relates to the social and political factors on the ground. How do shutdowns shift in the lead up to an election? How likely are they leading up to an election? What happens after an election? Not just in terms of the internet, but in how people respond. Does a shutdown increase or decrease the amount of political violence, the amount of sort of protest or things like that? And can we understand these dynamics and feed into the policy process to try and reduce the effects, the negative effects that happens? So just to conclude then, at the multi-stakeholder level, which I think is hugely important to tackling this problem, what we need to do is to continue this route of drawing from the strengths and the perspectives of each stakeholder, not in terms of what do they want out of it, but what does civil society bring? It brings an ability to work with people on the ground, to advocate for people on the ground, and to interact with policy. Policymakers have the ability to drive policy directly, limited by the need for agreement nationally and internationally. Academia provides the analytical tools, the perspectives, and the methods, and business provides resources, infrastructure, and there's a lot of crossover between these. But I'm so happy to see that this community in this field takes this multi-stakeholder approach very strongly, and so that coordination is something I hope will continue going forward. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Josh. Really, really helpful. I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, which in the room, Alex from Google. Alex, could you talk a little bit about the perspective of the private sector, really? How can the private sector help address this challenge? And how does the private sector, how is it affected by internet shutdowns? Thank you.
Am I on? Oh, there we go. Thanks for that question. And it's nice to come after Felicia and Josh, because I think you hit on a lot of the things that are also important to us in the private sector and that we think are important to be partnering with you on, to continue partnering with you on. These issues have long been a priority for Google. You know, we believe in a free and open internet. That has always been a core value of Google and its products and the way that we interact in the world. And so the increase in shutdowns that Felicia talked about is something that's deeply troubling to us and is part of why we believe in the multi-stakeholder model and in engaging with governments and civil society and academia and others in industry to make sure that there is data available to those of us who are studying it, as well as informing public policy statements and advocacy to ensure that governments who are using shutdowns understand what the repercussions are and hopefully can think of more tailored ways to address the problems that that they're seeking to work on by doing shutdowns and disruptions and throttling. In particular, you know, one thing we had sort of emailed about before was thinking about the value of human rights due diligence when we think about shutdowns. And for us, it is something that we think about when we think about how our products are operating in the world. We do have to think about sort of how we evaluate and plan when we know these things are going to happen, and how do we sort of design potentially around this kind of activity that will ultimately affect the people who are trying to use our tools, the devices that run on our operating systems, et cetera. The thing about shutdowns is they're rarely, from a human rights perspective, rarely necessary and rarely proportionate. They're a blunt tool that impacts all of our users and all of our services. And so from a company's perspective, it's bad for business because it's bad for everyone who uses our products. And I think Joss was hitting on this a little bit, but certainly it's everyone who's messaging and trying to communicate with their friends and family members. It's people who are trying to use digital payments and trying to send money back and forth. It impacts businesses, small and large, around the world. So it really does, it's not just GDP, it's every sort of interaction that we're trying to digitize for people. When you have disruptions, that means that that activity can't happen. And so I do think it's interesting to think about ways we can maybe illustrate that and measure how that impacts people in all of these small ways that really add up. For us, we have, again, like I said, for a long time been working on these issues. And so one thing in particular that we have always had is a disruptions report on our transparency site. And so what that does is it tracks the sort of activity across all of Google products around the world, and you can see when the activity gets low on any given product. Ultimately, when there is a shutdown, Google doesn't directly control any of the infrastructure. So when there's a shutdown, we normally learn about it when people are not able to access our products. It's not something that we know about ahead of time. So that's sort of the value of the transparency report. It makes sure that when we are learning that these things are happening, everyone else is learning that at the same time. And so transparency is one place where I think we've spent a lot of energy making sure that everyone has access to information about when these things are happening so that advocacy can happen. My colleagues in Jigsaw, they are sort of our think, do tank internally, have really invested also in transparency, but in partnering with other organizations to make sure that there's more data sharing and creating more comprehensive visibility around the impacts of shutdowns and disruptions. So that's included partnership and support of the Measurement Lab, as well as UNI and various others, and I'm sure Joss has also worked closely with them as well. So that is one place where we are continuing to invest in kind of the measurement and tracking and information sharing around transparency and disruptions. Just to maybe highlight a little bit more of the other ways we're working with other stakeholders, we've long supported the Keep It On campaign and think that the advocacy role is something that needs to be supported by those of us in industry, and I think many of the companies that are part of Global Network Initiative have long done that. And that's also part of why we engage with TFIS as part of the Freedom Online Coalition. We think that engaging with like-minded governments who understand all of the problems with disruptions and why that's not the best way to solve whatever challenges are happening in any given country, that it's important for private sector to be at the table talking about what we're seeing, what we're tracking, and to come to the table with one voice on that. And then the last thing I just wanted to flag is that Joss, it was funny that you said, law school would be useful, because I would say, as someone who's a lawyer, that actually it's really important for us to be partnered with technologists, because ultimately, sort of when I go back to the human rights due diligence and how do we plan for addressing these issues, really that does require us to think about what tools are available to people. And so, again, my colleagues in Jigsaw have focused on building things like Outline, which is a product that's focused on VPNs, and how do we make sure that VPNs are more accessible to people? How do we ensure that people can maintain access when these things are happening? And those really are questions that require technologists to be at the table with policymakers. So maybe that does just reinforce the value of all the stakeholders at the table, both from a technical and an advocacy perspective.
Thank you so much, Alex. Really helpful. We're just going to go to our last speaker before we open it up to all of you for questions. So do cling on to those questions. We'll be coming to you. Scott, if I may, your organization recently had a number of recommendations after you issued a report on internet shutdowns. What's your assessment on the progress of trying to facilitate positive change in this field, building on those recommendations? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kanbar. And thanks to the UK and the Freedom Online Coalition and all of the different actors involved in organizing this, Google, Oxford, and Access Now. We're really pleased to take part in a multi-stakeholder discussion. And at the risk of repeating you a little bit, Kanbar, in your opening remarks, but our office has been a champion of multi-stakeholder approaches and will continue to be one going forward. The value of this kind of conversation is clear, and this will be a priority area for our office in ensuring that participatory decision-making processes, and like the one that Alex just mentioned, are truly participatory, and that civic space is clearly protected so that all can take part freely in such discussions on the challenges of internet governance, and also on the topic of today on shutdowns. The progress on shutdown, so I was asked to speak on that in the frame of our report. I think the first thing I would say is that we very much need a multi-stakeholder approach to make progress. To quote Joss, or misquote Joss, but we need a multi-stakeholder approach to provide input into solving the problem. And I think that's a key takeaway, and I see in this conversation opportunities for the Freedom Online Coalition to be thinking about in 2025, for Google to be thinking about, for all of us, to be thinking about alongside member states with how to move the dial. I don't want to repeat Felicia. I think she, in terms of the progress, if we can frame it as progress made, backsliding perhaps. But I did want to salute Access Now for the exceptional work that they've done through the Keep It On campaign and having really important data on what the trends actually are in the world. So I won't repeat that. For today, I thought it would be more useful really to look at opportunities for problem solving through the multi-stakeholder lens and hooking to the Global Digital Compact. And what I think is really today our most significant frame, multi-stakeholder frame for problem solving. Multi-stakeholderism is clearly reaffirmed in the Global Digital Compact. And I think this, for our office, in terms of making progress on the recommendations, in our report, we need to seize this opportunity along with all. I just want to touch on a couple of those hooks and maybe ask a few questions even, or put out a few ideas. I think, as most of you that follow the Global Digital Compact are aware, it is firmly anchored in international human rights law. And I think it's also fair to say the GDC doesn't move us forward in terms of a normative framework, but it does move us forward in terms of having 193 member states reaffirm their commitment to human rights in the digital space and reaffirm their commitment to multi-stakeholderism. So I think we just need to seize on that recommitment or commitment from some and those affirmations and seize that political momentum. And we're very pleased that our office is one of the 5 UN entities that is called upon to implement, which is a huge challenge and leads me just to the two areas I'll focus on in terms of hooks. Most of you, if you're attending this workshop on shutdowns, you probably noticed the very clear language on internet shutdowns in the GDC. It's quite simple, watered down in some ways from where it was, but I think very effective in calling for states to simply refrain from internet shutdowns. Where are the opportunities to push on that very clear commitment? Companies, and Alex, you touched on this, but there's a clear call on companies to respect human rights and to apply human rights due diligence throughout the full life cycle of technology. What are the opportunities to move forward also in a multi-stakeholder fashion on that? And I think there's work, you gave one example, and I think Felicia touched on another interesting example, which is the Democratic Republic of Congo, where a couple of weeks ago at the annual Forum on Business and Human Rights, Vodafone was talking about the agreement that they came to with support from civil society and the government of the DRC in a pre-electoral context. Now, what was the impact of that agreement? Where are the shortcomings, the gaps? How can it be used as an example to build on? Open question. And then the last area is Objective 1 of the GDC on connectivity. And this, in our view, is likely to be a massive area of investment from international financial institutions, from the United Nations, and a huge opportunity to integrate human rights concerns into agreements around connectivity. And as different types of infrastructure and connectivity projects are being established, there's a key moment for prevention, as we outlined in our report, but for language to be included that makes it very difficult for governments to shut down and easier for companies to push back with their legal tools against shutdowns. I'm going to stop there because I could go on, but I sense we're at time and really look forward to the conversation. Thanks again for including us.
Thank you, Scott. Some really helpful concluding remarks there. Now I'm going to open up for question and answers. I'm going to first look to the room here. So if you do want to ask a question, can you hear me? Quick sound check. Yep, okay. If you do want to ask a question, please make your way forward. There's a mic there at the front, and you're very welcome. So who would like to open up? Great. Please come in. Oh, I think we may need to turn the mic on. Do you want to use my mic?
Oops.
I just wanted to ask about any kind of good examples where policy advocacy actually made a difference. on influencing internet sort of shutdowns or preventing them? Any that goes for people in the on the panel or in the room, and if so, what was the anatomy of that influence? Um,
Great. Before I pass that on, I think there's another hand up. We'll have two questions in the room, and then I'll ask the panel to come in on that.
Thank you. Are there any proactive steps in order to mitigate the disaster that will be behind internet shutdown for countries? Thank you.
Great. Well, I'll take that last one. I think in proactive steps, I think meetings like this are an example of that. We're trying to raise the awareness around internet shutdowns. We're trying to take a holistic approach in terms of the impact of shutdowns, be it from the issues around civil political rights, be it from issues about economy, but also development. So this is an example of that, but also our work through advocacy of the Task Force Internet Shutdowns and work on Freedom Online Coalition. So we're trying to be proactive there, but certainly there's much more we can do. Who in the panel would like to come in on the point was raised about some positive examples about advocacy working? I see Felicia, you're nodding. Do you want to briefly address that? Thanks.
Yes, definitely. I think I mentioned some good examples, having commitments from governments. And I think this is prior engagement. So it comes under the Election Watch initiative and Keep It On, where we are able to engage with governments prior to elections to raise awareness about shutdowns, the harms they have on human rights, and how people can actually leverage connectivity to actively participate in the electoral processes. And so through these engagements, that is when we got governments like the DRC, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone to make commitments to keep it on throughout the electoral processes. We've also taken governments to court and won against internet shutdowns. And the ECOWAS court has so far passed two or three judgments in favor of civil society against internet shutdowns, one in Togo, in Nigeria during the Twitter blocking, and also in Guinea, where civil society sued the authorities for disrupting internet access. So these are some positives, and in addition to the examples that Kamba mentioned. And I think proactive measures are really important, but some of the triggers is very difficult to predict, like protests, like conflict. We don't know when they just spring up on us, and we have to find solutions to that. But with elections over time, we've been able to prepare ahead and to engage with stakeholders to push back against election-related shutdowns.
Thank you, Felicia. I'm just going to make a note. I can't see comments coming in online. I joined a little bit late, so I might ask Josh and Felicia if you could make a scrub of any comments in the chat and bring them to our attention. But while that happens, I do see a hand up in the room. So if you would like to come and ask a question and introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nikki Muscati. First, I just want to say thank you so much to the UK government for continuing to chair the Task Force on Internet Shutdowns in the FOC, and thank you to all the panelists. I look forward to this session every year. But I have two questions, if I may. One is actually to Google. You know, Alex, you were talking quite a bit about how the ability for people to be able to actually access all the different Google products is key for the ability for Google to actually do business in a country. And so I guess one of the things that I'm wondering is when you are considering introducing products in different new countries and different new settings, is are internet shutdowns something that you look at? Are internet disruption something that you look at when you're considering the expansion of Google products in new markets? I think it's just helpful for people to know, because I think there's such broad conversation about FDI, but it's not really looked at from like a government perspective, from a private sector perspective in that way. So it'd just be helpful if you could share it. And then the second question I have is, you know, we talk a lot, I think it was Joss that was sort of noting that governments will shut down the internet and they'll provide a justification, and sometimes it's not resolving the issue that they want. Sometimes it's having the exact effect that they want. But the issue that they're trying to resolve is one that has nothing actually to do with the internet itself. And so I guess that I'm wondering for the panelists or for the room is we've been having this conversation for a long time. The fact that government shutdowns are often imposed because someone is trying to address something that really doesn't have to actually do with the internet. Has there been conversation in these sort of multi-stakeholder settings on how do you address the actual root issue at hand? I think one of the things we hear is we got to shut down the internet because there's a protest that's going to happen. Those are all just very different things that are, one technical, technically a solution that's not a real solution being applied. So, thanks.
Thank you so much, Nikki. So one question for Alex, and then we have a question which I think very much chimes with Nikki's second question around chatting to governments and trying to explain issues. So maybe I might ask one of Joss or Scott if they want to address that. But Alex, over to you. We had a question directed at you. Thanks.
Hi. Yeah, that's a good question. I think, there are myriad factors that get evaluated when we think about where we're going to expand business for any given product. But one of the sort of buckets of things that we focus on is the operating environment. So what is rule of law like? What are the regulations that we may have to comply with? And certainly whether or not there is access available, what the infrastructure is the government shutting it down on a regular basis, are things that we would highlight when we're thinking about the riskiness of a country, and is it worthwhile to expand our business there? So it is something that comes up absolutely when we're doing those evaluations.
Thanks, Alex. And then we've got a question which was talked about having a dialogue with states, trying to really explain the challenges around this. I might ask Joss to come in on that, and then Scott, there's a question in the chat directly for you. So Joss, do you want to address that one? And then Scott, if you could come in afterwards. Thanks. Alex, Scott, you come in after that, but Joss, first to you.
Yeah, I think this sort of trying to understand the relationship between the intended action of some authority, whether it's local government or national government, and what they actually do. I'm beginning to suspect that maybe policymakers are not entirely rational actors at all times in the way that they make their policies. And in many senses, there is this knee-jerk reaction. And in some cases, it's, I say it carefully, but justifiable. I've certainly seen cases where the stated intention is, there is sectarian violence going on in this region that is being spread by social media. We don't see an alternative. This is the only thing we can think of to do. And as somebody that is utterly against internet shutdowns, I can still have sympathy with that perspective, because if I don't try to understand why an authority wants to shut down the internet, I can't work proactively to try and prevent them from having that conclusion. And I think that's something we really need to accept as a community, that it's not an us and them problem. It's a problem to work at together. How can we prevent this from happening? And I think that there's a much wider point there, which is, most people in this room would probably share this opinion with me. If you'd told me 10 years ago that internet shutdowns would be increasing, I was studying censorship 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And the perspective would always have been the internet's becoming more and more important. It's becoming more and more embedded in society. Everyone is using it. It's necessary. How could it possibly be shut down? It's just going to die off as something that you wouldn't do. And yet it is. And why is that happening? Partially because the authorities who are trying to achieve their societal or political or economic goals don't feel that they have an alternative lever of power to achieve that. And so it's become an all or nothing problem, especially with the rise of encryption on the internet, which is obviously, from my perspective, an unmitigated good. But it's meant that some of the more subtle or insidious forms of censorship, where you could block pages or keywords or other things, have gone away. And states are now being presented with the option, we either shut down everything, or functionally everything in terms of the large major services, or we have no control over this. And that's a difficult position for a state or authority to be in. And so that's why I focus a lot of my work on trying to understand the motivations and the impacts, because it feels to me that that is the most proactive way and holistic way to try and combat this problem, rather than the 10, 15-year ago approach, which was more naive, which was saying, we will just stop, we'll just find ways to get around your censorship and you'll eventually give up. And that's obviously not happened. So I think that really drives to the heart of certainly my research agenda, but where I think we need to be thinking in these terms.
Thanks, Josh. And can I bring in Scott now? We have a question in the chat I think you've seen about institutional structures, and does the UN have a recommended model? Do you see the question in the chat?
No, I haven't seen that question.
How can we ensure enable national states to use multi-stakeholder model by creating institutional structures to engage all interested bodies? Does the UN have a recommended model? We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry, lost power. Missed the question. I just really want to emphasize what Josh was just saying, that we see more and more governments looking for tech solutions to what are deep societal problems, and in a nutshell. And the root causes of protests, indeed, are related to a lot of our bread and butter work, but promoting freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, non-discrimination and exclusion. So I think we need to look at those societal causes and take on the reality of the human rights space that is or is not available to get to the problem. Similarly with online racism. The racism won't go away if we start censoring racism online. So I think that there are, we see a lot of knee-jerk reactions in that space. So now that my ears are back on, I still can't read anything without my glasses, but there's a question about institutional
structures to engage interested bodies. Do any of your recommendations address how we can institutionalize the multi-stakeholder approach?
Absolutely, yes. Well, it's a good plug too. Hope to see everybody at the next IGF, and the next IGF, and the next IGF.
Perfect. We've reached I've got to sign and say we've got about 3 minutes left, but there's one question in the room, and I might try and wrap up things. I'll give you my mic. Do you want to introduce yourself and ask the question? Thanks.
Thank you. So that it was my question. So the question was, how can we promote national governments to use this multi-stakeholder body to develop the policies, including all parties, etc.?
Sorry,
we can hear you now.
Connectivity. Yeah. The short answer is also leverage the Global Digital Compact. Whatever government, 193 governments have just committed to a multi-stakeholder model. There's very clear language. I'm forgetting on which objective or whether it's in the introductory parents, but there is clear language committing to multi-stakeholderism and an inclusive IGF that's in there. I think this is, again, it's not anything new that we couldn't find in existing international human rights law and principles, but the fact that governments have collectively come together and reaffirmed that gives us space for advocacy and for peer pressure.
Thank you so much. I'm going to wrap this up now, really. I'm going to say a few words and maybe ask each panelist to very briefly come up with any sort of concluding thoughts. I think from my perspective, I just want to thank everyone again. I think today is a real demonstration. This panel is a real demonstration of the power of the multi-stakeholder approach. I think one particular point which I want to draw out, which hasn't been highlighted, is good state practice. Often it's very easy to highlight examples where states have actually shut the internet down. Representing the British government, I would say this, wouldn't I? But in the summer in the UK just gone, we experienced some really shocking riots across the country. They had a real impact on our social fabric. They were reported widely, and they entailed quite a lot of violence. However, during that time, the internet was not shut down. Policymakers took the decision not to do that. So I just highlight that because good state practice can encourage other states to look at this and realize that this is a blunt tool and there are wider societal issues at play and there are different levers available to address that. So with that in mind, I might ask each panelist very briefly to have sort of concluding thought for us. So Felicia, do you want to come in?
Yes, just to rehash that the fight against internet shutdowns needs multi-stakeholderism. And so it's important for us to continue to work together to push back against these rights harming practices. Thank you.
Thank you. Jos, any concluding thoughts?
Just to agree with what you said, and I think really in terms of understanding the motivations and the activities of the authorities that are engaging in internet shutdowns, we all agree that this is a blunt tool and there are alternative ways to achieve those goals. Let's not fall into the same problem of thinking that we can have similarly blunt solutions. We need to be just as sort of subtle and holistic in how we address this problem if we're going to bring it together, and multi-stakeholderism is the way to do that.
Thank you. Alex?
I'm not sure I have anything additional to add because we continue to be committed to multi-stakeholder model. Maybe the one thing I'll just highlight is that I do think companies, Google in particular, but not just Google, are really interested in continuing to work directly with civil society to understand how you're experiencing the impact of shutdown so that we can continue to think about building tools that are effective as part of the work that we're doing. And
last but not least, Scott.
No, thanks. I learned quite a bit in the dialogue, so thanks for including us. And I guess I'm inspired to have to go deeper into some of the examples that Felicia was putting out there as possible models, good and bad, but how we can learn together and to improve member state practice in the shutdown space.
Great. Well, thank you to our panelists, but also thank you to everyone else who's joined us both in the room and online. Thank you.